My name is Christopher Eastman. I'm manager of the local government training program, and I'm presenting with Paula Gilbert. And we're presenting a course called Tips for Regulating Telecommunications Facilities. And like all of our courses, this course, although maybe especially so, we're introducing concepts to you and not telling you everything you need to know about them. We're introducing these concepts for you and we're going to provide you resources to research further about them and to know where to look when you're faced with these challenges. There's no way we can tell you everything there is to know about regulating telecommunications facilities. It's a hot button issue, and we're not attorneys. So we're generalists. We're not experts on the subject. So the emphasis in this course is tips. And this way, we hope that we'll be enabling you to address adequately the applications that come before you by telecommunications companies, so not to get yourself and your local government into trouble. It's a special use. It kind of falls into, there's some special rules that we'll be going over that pertain to telecommunications facilities. And we emphasize that if you do have an application and it's controversial, if it's not a straightforward application for a telecommunications facility in an area where it's an as of right use, for example, or something that really doesn't need too much review, if there's pushback on it, then we strongly encourage you to have an attorney who knows about telecommunications facilities and the rules surrounding them, and a radio frequency engineer as well that you can call upon for assistance, for more assistance to your municipality. So we're gonna be talking about conventional towers and telecommunications facilities that are installed on existing structures. And we will be going into, at the end of the course, toward the end of the course, small cell technology. And the policies, I'll just say this before we move on to the course outline, something that we should just understand right out is that the policies for local governments have been written at the federal level to expedite approval, because these are utilities that we're talking about. And I'm going to go dark. Sarah, I think you might not be muted. I'm hearing a little background noise there. So I'm going to go dark. I'm going to turn my camera off so I'm not distracted by it and you aren't distracted by me. And that way, what I've done with my screens is not having my picture up there will help me focus on the presentation. So, oh great, now I'm not able to advance the slideshow, at least not from my keyboard. Okay, I don't know what I did, but I'm always, maybe one day I'll be good at webinars and Zoom. So again, our course outline, we'll introduce the concept to you in a little more detail than I just did a few minutes ago. And we'll talk about the Telecommunications Act of 1996, which really set everything set these regulations in motion, and everything that all the rules that pertain to local governments around approving telecommunications facilities are kind of based on that 1996 law. We'll talk a little bit about safety around both the structures and radio frequency, aesthetics, regulating telecommunications facilities for aesthetics, and a really strange piece of legislation that was buried in the Middle Class Tax Relief and Job Creation Act of 2012 that is kind of a big deal for local governments that maybe some of you don't know about. We'll talk briefly about litigation and how to avoid it. That's really what this course is about. And we'll wrap up with small cell and discussion of 5G technology. And we've presented this course a couple of times. One of my colleagues reminded me to the Southern Tier West audience. So I'm assuming that most of you today have not seen it before. And if you have, consider a review, because the course has been updated some, but the big news was 5G and the small cell regulations that we'll be going over at the end of this course. That was a couple years ago, I think in 2018, 2019. So the course has little changed since the last time we did it for Southern Tier West. So a little bit of background: telecommunications are a utility, and they're mostly unregulated by the federal and state governments, whereas most utilities are highly regulated. Cell phones and their infrastructure, this kind of telecommunications infrastructure, is really little regulated. As I said right at the outset, there has been policy written at the federal level to expedite deployment of this infrastructure, but it's little regulated by the federal and state governments. And local governments, because of these policies written to expedite deployment of telecommunications infrastructure, are somewhat limited in the extent that they can regulate it. For most uses, and we have a course called Hot Button Land Uses where we talk about the exceptions to this rule. Most uses, local governments in their zoning can highly restrict and even zone out, but telecommunications is one that you definitely cannot zone out. And this infrastructure, as we'll learn, and I think many local governments have found this already, it's not just one line that goes through your community. It's redundant. There are lots of towers, there are different providers. And so you see here a photo of a water tower, and the local government has taken advantage of this high point that's already standing in its municipality, in the town, and it's leasing space to multiple providers. And really that's the best way of deploying this infrastructure is not having a bunch of freestanding cell towers, but co-locating it on existing infrastructure. One of the reasons there are a lot of towers, among the reasons there are a lot of towers, not only to fill in the gaps in service, but also tower development ends up being pretty lucrative for the middleman site developer, who gets paid a lot by the companies, the telecommunications providers, for having a site they can locate on. So the Telecommunications Act of 1996 created the rules that we will go over in greater detail in the next few slides. The good news is, and this is just a little bit of good news, is that beyond this, local governments retain their full zoning powers to regulate wireless facilities in their jurisdictions, except to the extent that it is limited to these 5 factors. And these 5 factors are significant, and that's why this course is really based on them. So the first one, again, we'll go over them in greater detail, slide by slide, in the next few. The government may not unreasonably discriminate among providers. They may not prohibit wireless facilities. So number 2 is really the big one. Number 3, they must act in reasonable time. Their decisions, like everything else we talk about, must be supported by substantial evidence. And number 5, and this is news to some people, but it's a fairly fundamental element of this act. Local governments may not regulate their placement, the location of telecommunications facilities based on radio frequency emissions if those emissions comply with FCC regulations. So a little more about each one now. The unreasonable discrimination. Any discrimination between providers must be reasonable. And what that means is that local governments can't say to one company that that company may not have a tower because another company already has a tower or a facility in that local government, in that municipality. That would be unreasonable discrimination. We prefer Verizon to AT&T or something along those lines would certainly be unreasonable discrimination. But if there are already alternatives for locating telecommunications facilities and there's a proposal to build one, arguing on the side of the local government that the local government would like the new provider to co-locate on either an existing facility, on an existing tower, or other facility, tall building like tall structure like a water tower or a church steeple. Having the reasoning that preservation of neighborhood character and aesthetics is reasonable and permissible, because and an increase related to that, the next point, an increase in the number of towers can justify differential treatment of providers. So if the cost of leasing space on an existing facility is a little higher for a provider who comes later to the game, that is a reasonable, because of the number of towers that might already be existing in that municipality, restricting the number of new towers, and requiring that the new facility be co-located is not seen as unreasonable, is justifiable treatment, differential treatment of providers. And this, even though it's a little, it might be a little, it's our first rule, and the idea of reasonable versus unreasonable discrimination is kind of a legal term of art. It's not generally a problem for local governments. And when I was really kind of digging into this, that was a bit of a surprise to me that this is kind of it seems like a tough one, but it's rarely the problem for local governments. That number 2 is the prohibition of wireless service. Local governments, and this is right out of the Telecommunications Act, may not prohibit or have the effect of prohibiting wireless service. Now, significant gap is not defined in the Telecommunications Act, but it was somewhat by a couple of cases that are on the screen and we'll review briefly. In New York SMA Partnership versus the Town of Oyster Bay Zoning Board of Appeals in 2010, so this wasn't all that long ago, in terms of conventional telecommunications technology, the court said a coverage gap exists when a remote user of those services is unable to connect a land-based telephone network, or to maintain a connection capable of supporting a reasonably uninterrupted communication where a coverage gap exists. Where a coverage gap exists, customers cannot receive and send signals. And when customers pass through a coverage gap, their calls are disconnected. So this is something of a definition of significant gap, where a telephone conversation, a cell conversation is not possible. And where if you're driving through that area where the gap is, your calls will be dropped. A further definition, Nextel Partners versus the town of Amherst, where the holes in coverage are very limited in number or size, such as home interiors in rural areas, the lack of coverage will likely be de minimis. So these two court cases defined what significant versus de minimis coverage gaps are. So the test here, a lot of the time, the provider, an applicant, will come in front of you and come in front of your board and have a coverage map and say there's a significant gap in service in this location, and so there's a need for a telecommunications facility. Now, if your zoning is consistent with that and it's a matter of receiving the planning board or zoning board of appeals, whichever board grants, reviews and grants special use permits, reviews the applications and grants special use permits. If it's a matter of meeting the criteria of for telecommunications facilities and they are permitted special uses, no big deal. The special use permit can be granted. If they are not permitted in that location, or there's some aspect of the facility that does not comply with zoning and cannot be granted a special use permit, then you might consider testing the question of whether a significant gap in fact does exist. If you don't have anything to, if you don't have any evidence that there is no significant gap in coverage, then the provider will take the map and say, there's a significant gap in coverage, we need the permit for this, and the local government won't have anything to stand on if they have a map and you don't have anything. But there have been a couple instances in which the local government challenged whether there was a gap in service, and a number of volunteers took a drive survey and recorded the data, made a number of calls. For example, 20 people made 20 calls in various locations in the purported significant gap area. They recorded their locations and how many, if any, calls were dropped. And first of all, if calls were possible, if it was possible to make the calls, and if they were possible to be made, whether they were dropped. And then that data was collected by these volunteers and submitted as a report to substantiate that a gap does not exist. For example, if only 10 of those calls, those many calls that were made, were dropped, whereas if most of the calls were dropped, then that's evidence that in fact a significant gap in coverage probably exists, and the application should move forward based on that. I'm gonna, we forgot to test to see if Paula can advance the slides, but if you can, you can. Okay, so we didn't make good use of our pre-planning time on today's webinar. So just tell me when to advance the slides, Paula. All right. Thanks.
So the third prong is the reasonable, you have to make a reasonable like time for a decision. So in November 1999, the shot clock was implemented. That's where the FCC imposed timeframes of 90 days for co-location applications and 150 days for the siting of new facilities, because they found that a lot of municipalities were, I think, expecting these were controversial, uses coming to, to communities. And a lot of people didn't really know how to handle them. So a lot of times when you're dealing with new technology, I think a lot of people tend to try to drag it out as long as possible, just because they are a little, nervous about the technology itself. So the federal government recognized that and imposed these timeframes to essentially try to, keep these applications moving so that the technology could be, implemented across the country. And so 90 days for co-location means if it's a new, if you're adding to an existing tower, 150 days for a new tower itself. And if the local government fails to act, the applicant can file a complaint with the federal court for a court order of approval. You really don't want to try to do this just because a lot of times this is pretty messy. It's an expensive process, and it's especially slow because a lot of times this is done in the federal courts. The federal courts are pretty slow, even probably more slow now due to, this pandemic that we're going through. So you really want to try to keep, these providers from suing your municipality. But also, if the application is incomplete, the review board must notify the applicant within 30 days of receipt. And that's important too, because a lot of people think like, oh, well, if we just don't get or we keep getting an incomplete application, we could just drag out the shot clock on and on and on. It's really important, I think, to make sure that you have municipal staff ready to make a determination on an application about whether it's complete or not, because, you have to make that decision quickly. You don't want to drag this out. And if it's not complete, you just need to let them know in writing what is not, what is missing, and have them resubmit. And this is just another tip to put out there that we always say is use checklists. Be careful about the timelines. It's always good to be, very cognizant of when applications show up, date stamp them so that you always know, because in terms of litigation, a lot of times these providers have, a lot of bargaining power on their side and a lot of, power against municipalities. So you just want to make sure that you are doing everything as, to the T as possible. So having a checklist is always super helpful. It's helpful for you. It's helpful for other municipal boards that are, or other municipal officials that may have to look at it, especially if you have an engineer that needs to look at it. Just keep everything, in the same place. Chris, you can go to the next slide. And of course, the fourth is the substantial evidence in record. The local governments must provide their decisions on wireless facilities in writing. And really, you should be doing this for all applications anyway, but specifically, you're not allowed to do essentially, word of mouth deals. And the decision, of course, should be based on substantial evidence and contain sufficient explanation for reasons for denial to allow courts to evaluate evidence in the record supporting the decision. Basically, what that means is, like all findings, you have to make sure that, you have substantial evidence as to why you're denying a permit. And substantial evidence is relevant and reasonable to support the conclusion. So here, don't base it on health reasons. We'll talk about that in the next couple of slides. You want to make sure your evidence in the record is crystal clear. The more robust your findings, the better, especially if you're challenged in a federal court, because this is where the judge is going to be reading all of the findings that are submitted on a specific application. So make sure that they're robust. You're probably going to want to have your municipal attorney involved as well. We can go to the next slide. And preclusion of regulations for RF emissions. I think back in the 90s when this was happening, there was a lot of genuine fear about the radio frequency emissions from these types of structures. So the local government cannot regulate construction or placement of wireless facilities on health effects of radio frequency emissions if those emissions comply with FCC emissions regulations. So you turn to the FCC for emissions regulations. And unfortunately, if they comply, then your hands are more tied in terms of going along with it. So again, if your facilities comply with emissions regulations, you cannot deny based on your health effects. And that's the same for these more old-fashioned, towers, which are more like 4G, 3G, and below. And it's the same for 5G as well. We'll talk some more about that in the future. And the protection, again, is determined by the facility's compliance with the FCC emission standards. So we can move to the next one. But of course, like we always say, have due diligence about it. Some local governments enact requirements for random testing at the facility owner's expense for excessive radio frequency emissions. So, a applicant comes before you, they say that it's going to happen within, whatever they're building is of course going to be within the parameters set by the FCC, but it's always good to hire your own, RF emissions engineer to go by and do a test, after it was built to make sure that, they are saying that they're within the perimeters that they're allowed to. And in these communities, if, the RF emissions are found to exceed those maximums, the facility must be dismantled by the owner. And this is particular in Nassau County, where places are more, in communities where they're more densely developed. And this is important because, where you have communities with lots of, multifamily housing, you might think that you have the distance from something, but you might find that if you're sticking it on a building, you might be closer to people living than you think, which is what I think Chris is going to talk about in a couple of slides. In the meantime, the next slide. Safety, of course, is a big deal when it comes to, any RF emissions and any cell towers that are being built. So freestanding towers are exempt from the New York Uniform Fire Prevention and Building Code. So it's always important to let people know that occasionally these towers can collapse. They can also light on fire occasionally. And of course, we live in the Northeast where it is cold in the winter. So if ice accumulates on these towers, and if it's a 150-foot tower, when it melts, the ice can reach speeds of 70 miles an hour by the time it reaches the ground. So you don't want to have, these built anywhere close to, schools or places where people are clearly walking or next to sidewalks, because you don't want to see anybody get injured by that. So the tips here is make sure that you have setbacks of at least 100 to 200% the height of the tower, and make sure that you're measuring it from the base, not from the property line, to prevent like postage stamp or flag lot construction. You want to make sure that there's enough space around that if something was to, fall, or if it was to light on fire, or something, was to maybe fell off it in a windstorm, that the damage would be minimal. And another important thing to keep in mind is make sure that you have fencing around these as well. You see it in the picture here, because as we all know, kids like to climb things as well as adults actually. So, and if you ever go onto YouTube, you can see videos of people climbing construction towers like 200, stories off, like 100 stories off the ground, which always really freak me out. So make sure that you always have, ample security around them to try to keep people from pursuing that. And I think Chris will talk about some more safety.
Yeah, I'll take the next one. And speaking of YouTube and examples of people doing crazy things, well, in this case, it's just crazy things happening. I didn't realize how that towers collapsing and catching on fire was something that did happen once in a while. And somebody recommended that I check that out on YouTube, burning or collapsing telecommunications towers. And
I mean, not
find
just
them,
them,
find
like,
them pretty easily.
yeah, I mean, that happens, but same with construction cranes. Sometimes, unfortunately, anything that you're putting together, like sometimes can fail. So it's even more important to be particularly safe about your regulations.
Yeah. One of the attorneys who taught me a lot of this material said something along the lines of and I get a lot of questions just from county planners who are reviewing applications that are setbacks of less than the height of the tower. And why would you have less than the height of the tower as a setback if the tower could potentially topple over? Well, sometimes the pitches, they are designed to collapse in place and not to topple over. And the attorney who taught me a lot of the material in this course said, if they collapse at all, if they fall, that's a failure in itself. So how can you trust that they will fail the way they've been designed to fail? So he had a point there, I thought. So just that adequate setbacks are important for safety is something to remember for your laws as you're revising them, because I think most local governments at this point have regulations that do pertain to conventional telecommunications facilities, if not small cell. So on the theme of safety and radio frequency levels are among those elements that are regulated by the federal government. And there are formulas for the amount of radio frequency emissions based on how close the facilities are located to human habitation, to people who are going to be near them. And they're generally low and they're not hazardous, except for if you're exposed to them for prolonged periods of time, if people are exposed to them for prolonged periods of time. And this can be problematic potentially for small cells on faces of buildings. So that's something that we're going to have to look at. You'll have to be looking at when small cell in networks are deployed in your municipality, if they haven't been yet. But the tower radiation is generally less of a problem than your phones themselves, but it's constant. And many local governments have actually succeeded in placing towers at a safe distance from schools and residents where people would not be subjected to prolonged exposure at close proximity. But just be diligent in your review about the distance people will be from that radiation. There was one account that I came across in my studies that it was thought that the top floor of a building, when the facilities were being installed on the roof, was storage or space that was only occupied for small periods of time throughout the course of a month, for example. And turns out there was a residence on the top floor that it wasn't realized initially when the application was reviewed. And so the radio frequency levels in that case had to be modified. And then there was another one in which a story on Long Island in the town of Hempstead, in which a radio frequency engineer thought that the proposed facility complied in a church tower, in the tower of a church, because in general, nobody would be closer than 80 feet from the location of that facility, the instrument panel, the radio frequency emitter. But it was discovered that upon just the people who knew the facility well and what it needed, there was a clock tower the church clock. It was in a clock tower, and the clock had to be checked daily and wound. It was something that somebody had to be right up there with the equipment on a daily basis, not for long periods of time, but that required a lowering of the radio frequency emissions in that instance. So before the facilities are approved, everybody should be certain that human habitation within close proximity is limited and well known. We talked about aesthetics and the legitimacy of regulating towers by their aesthetics, and it's been found, just one of the studies that substantiates this purpose for regulation is that studies have found that facilities towering over nearby residences can lower the value of those nearby homes by between 5 and 20%. And if towers are too close to residences, the potential buyers will be unable to secure Federal Housing Administration guaranteed loans. So this is a big tip here, and it's something that I meant to say earlier in the program, and it's a recurring theme for us. Local governments should identify the ideal locations for these facilities as soon as they can. If you haven't yet, it should be part of your comprehensive planning process. Locate the best places to build telecommunications facilities, to permit telecommunications facilities, including municipally owned property, and facilities that can be in which the instrumentation can be placed on top of. And we've had some photos of those throughout. Public facilities, water towers, a tower on top of an emergency services building, for example. Those places, if your local governments identify those places, then you can expedite approvals and really not be caught off guard when an application comes before you for something that's controversial that you have to fight when it does emerge, that you're not making up the rules as you go, but you're prepared for these applications. And this is just a point to challenge some of the claims that regulation is the reason for inadequate coverage. And I guess that could still be argued, but I've spoken to attorneys at the Adirondack Park Agency, and when there were a couple incidents as a result in the Adirondacks where there was no cell coverage, and the APA was blamed for it, and regulation of telecommunications facility, overly burdensome regulation of telecommunications infrastructure by local governments was blamed for the unsafe conditions found by not having service in large swaths of the Adirondacks. The truth was that between the year 2000 and 2010, there were very few applications at all for telecommunications facilities. And for those that the Adirondack Park Agency does receive, the rules are that any facility has to not look like the one in the photo. They have to be below the tree line. So it's a bit of a challenge and a little more expensive for the private industry deploying the infrastructure that has some level of benefit of a utility, of a public utility. It's a little more expensive from that for them. It requires greater investment, but it just had to get to the point where it was profitable enough for them to build, to install a greater number of facilities. But in the Adirondacks, the providers know the rules. Tall structures must be substantially invisible, and most of the applications that come before the Adirondack Park Agency for telecommunications facilities are relatively uncontroversial because they know the rules and they know what they have to do. Providers know what they have to do to get a permit. Now, this is the Middle Class Tax Relief and Job Creation Act of 2012 that I spoke about a little earlier, also known as Section 6409, because Section 6409 is buried in this Middle Class Tax Relief and Job Creation Act of 2012. This is how legislation is done these days. Who would guess that a law with that title would have anything to do with telecommunications facilities? Well, it came out, and in fact, there was a lot of buzz at the time. And you don't have to furiously write down what I'm going to say here, because all of this information is in your attachments, which I hope I provided them to Sarah, and I hope you received them, the slides and the attachments to those slides, the supplementary materials. This section of the law said that state or local governments may not deny and shall approve any eligible facilities request for modification that does not substantially change the physical dimensions of such tower or base station. This is as limiting of local authority of any law, local authority to regulate land uses, of any law I know of. And it's a real challenge, and there's really nothing that local governments can do to prevent the expansion if it's not substantial, as this law says, if the tower has already been constructed. The tips here are a little tough, and we'll get to those in just a minute. The local governments must approve if the proposal does not substantially increase. And that, of course, that definition was not really, or that term was not really defined in the law, but it was interpreted later on to mean a substantial increase is increasing the tower size by more than 10 feet in height or 10%, whichever is greater if it's in a public right of way. If it's outside of a public right of way, it's 20 feet or 10%, whichever is greater. And in a public right of way, that means protrusion of more than 6 feet. Substantial is protrusion of more than 6 feet beyond the edge of the structure. So if the facility, if the communication equipment is expanded beyond 6 feet more than 6 feet beyond the edge of the structure, or installation of more than 4 equipment cabinets, and or no more than 20% of protrudence total. And excavation, as long as there's no excavation beyond the tower site, that qualifies as being not substantial. So if you were confused by anything I've said in this list, have a look at the attachments to the slides in the PDF that I hope you received from Sarah, and read them carefully. That's where I got them from. So the tips here are, again, if the tower has already been constructed, then there's really nothing you can do if the proposal for expansion is not substantial. So if it's not beyond 10 feet in height or 10%, if it's within the public right of way, if it doesn't, if the communications equipment does not protrude more than 6 feet, and if there's no excavation beyond the tower site itself, then that's not substantial. So you must approve it. There's no way you can deny it. But if there's a new conventional tower proposed, you can ask, the local government can ask an independent engineer if the base, you look at the base and ask if this tower, based on the base design, judging from the base design, could be 25 feet taller than what's being proposed. And if so, the applicant can be asked to agree to a restrictive covenant on the tower that it will never be higher than that in the initial application. And if the applicant agrees to the restrictive covenant, then you've got that restrictive covenant. If not, then this middle-class tax relief, the section 6409 would kick in, and there would be no way you could deny the expansion of the tower. And of course, we're most concerned about height and visibility. So that's why we use the example of 25 feet taller. So if they aren't in agreement, if they don't agree to that covenant, then if you can, if it's something that you feel as a local government is worth fighting for, then see if you can lower the tower height with the initial application. Because if you don't, this section 6409 will prevent you from denying the increased height years down the road if that's what the applicant hopes for. Now, I think one of our hopes for small cell is that these really huge towers, conventional towers, won't be as necessary in the future. That will be, the gaps will be filled in with smaller facilities, and we'll get to those in just a few minutes. But even though we want to emphasize that, and this is of course a point on which attorneys might disagree, and it's another point that we want to, it's another opportunity for us to emphasize that you should make sure you work through these applications with your attorney, with your municipal attorney, and if there's something that you're really concerned about will be very controversial, then you might find somebody who really knows a little something about telecommunications law. But the law is really written, the FCC regulations are written to expedite approvals of these facilities. But wireless companies, the laws aren't written to encourage wireless companies to take local governments to court and to extract money from them. That's not why these laws are there. These laws are written the way they are in order to deploy a network. So some attorneys advise that wireless companies can't recover monetary damages or attorney's fees. So you don't have to, if your applicants come and they're 4 attorneys and a stenographer, and they're all dressed to the nines, you don't have to worry too terribly. They are professional, they want their permits, but these applications can be intimidating to local governments. and many of whose board members are volunteers and really don't know as much as they do about these laws, as much as the applicants in this case do about the laws. But in a lot of cases, the telecommunications companies don't want to go to court. It's a lot faster for them to work with local governments to get the approval. And if it does go to court, a lot of the time the court will look at that record that Paula really emphasized. If you need substantial evidence in the record to deny, and then there's the shot clock element to it as well. The time limitations that you have they don't go automatically to court, but if you violate the shot clock, then it's very easy for the applicant to take their challenge to court. But the cases are most often resolved through a summary judgment in which the court will just say, grant the permit. Local government, you need to grant the permit for this telecommunications facility. And it ends there. And that is, we've heard a lot of stories like that. We've heard a few that don't, we've heard about a few expensive experiences of litigation, but most of the time they want the permit to build the facility and they don't want to drag the local government through the mud and cost you a lot of money. So I'm going to turn back the floor to the one person I know who has a 5G device to talk about 5G and small cell.
That's so ridiculous. Okay.
Ridiculous that I said it, or ridiculous that I know only one person who has a 5G device?
Can I say both?
Okay. We'll talk afterwards and you can fill me in on why.
Okay, so 5G essentially is the 5th generation cellular wireless network. So most devices on the market now are part of 4G, the 4th generation LTE. And 5G has 3 new aspects, which is greater speed, so you can move more data, and a real millimeter wave network can download a full-length 4K movie in seconds. It's pretty amazing. It also has lower latency, which means the network itself is more responsive. So there's less lag time between the transmitter and the device. So in the future, if self-driving cars become a thing that we see in a lot of our communities, they will require a continuous data stream to function properly and safely. So they're going to need more data and they need to get that data very quickly. And then of course, the 5th is the ability to connect more devices. And that's important because, the market itself is blowing up. What we've had in the past, and what we're seeing in terms of devices today are two totally separate things from, 20 years ago when we were talking about, the first generation of cell phones. Maybe there was, a couple 100,000 of them across the country. Now we're talking about, cellular devices at 20, 30 million and probably even more than that. And essentially 5G uses higher frequency data waves to transmit data, and it relies on small scale, low power transmitters placed throughout the landscape. And essentially here on the right, we have a picture, kind of explains it a little bit more, which is you have, your fancy usual cell tower, and then it transmits to these smaller substations, and those smaller substations then transmit data to your devices. The thing that's different about 5G, of course, is because they are minimal, smaller waves, they don't travel as far. So true millimeter wave, transmissions can get, quickly fall off when there's buildings. Even tree shade can really significantly reduce it. And there are, I feel like we'll go over this now because you see a lot of commercials on TV about, every network has 5G and it's kind of confusing. And there should be a slide in our, and I'll probably make it a slide after this, but there's three different, flavors or aspects of 5G. And the first, like we keep talking about, is the millimeter wave. And it's been deployed over the past 2 years by Verizon, AT&T, and T-Mobile. And it really allows that blazing fast connection. But with the higher frequency, smaller waves, they struggle covering distances, penetrating buildings. And like I said, tree shade can really mess with it. Some of them also can have issues in heated environments as well. So the bottom line here is like this kind of 5G is typically equipped in stadiums and arenas and in true downtowns. So we see it in places like Boston, Cambridge, Manhattan. But sometimes these coverage areas covered by this type of 5G is sometimes no bigger than an intersection. So you could really think of it more as a souped up Wi-Fi hotspot in the city outside. You'll get the best, frequency and range. And then the second is the low band 5G. And this is different. And this is what most of the networks are really like when you turn on the TV and you see a commercial, this is really what they're talking about. And it's low band 5G, where there's a lot more range, but the lower speeds. So this is really the foundation for all three providers, like nationwide 5G offerings. Sometimes it's faster than 4G LTE, mostly because there's things called like MIMO, multiple inputs, multiple outputs. But it doesn't offer the same crazy speeds of millimeter wave transmission. So like I was saying to my other half today, like I was kind of laughing because I do have a 5G enabled iPhone and I get 5G network inside my local Hannaford store, which I knew it wasn't true 5G because real millimeter wave transmissions wouldn't be able to hit my phone in the middle of a supermarket. So the low band, essentially, it functions the same way as, or very similarly to 4G networks in terms of range and coverage. So larger areas, it will work inside. Currently, T-Mobile offers this to 270 million people. AT&T offers it to 225 million. Verizon offers it to 230 million. So we're talking about faster speeds, but we're not talking about earth-shattering differences from a good like 4G LTE. And I have a feeling low band is what we're going to see mostly in more rural areas as well, just because you really need to have density of people and places to really make that millimeter wave 5G really work. And then the third is mid-band, which is kind of a middle ground of speed and coverage. So it's faster than the low band, and it offers more coverage than the millimeter wave. And this is the technology that was behind Sprint's 5G early rollout and was basically one of the key reasons why T-Mobile worked so hard to purchase it recently. And the mid-band covers with T-Mobile 100 million people. The goal is to get to 200 million by the end of 2021. Mid-band ranges were mostly previously used and owned by the military, which makes it, kind of a scarce resource despite its cellular benefits. However, this FCC last year just auctioned off a bunch of unused mid-band spectrum, and AT&T and Verizon were the biggest spenders. So the expectation is at least one of the two companies will roll it out by the end of this year. And it's really important to note that one band is not necessarily better or worse than another. The end goal of these networks is to incorporate all three types of spectrum for a more comprehensive network nationwide. And so when you see things, the nomenclature, of course, is different. When you see the commercials, you have like AT&T where they say 5GE. That actually isn't 5G at all, and they've received complaints about false advertising. But now they use 5G, which is really that low and mid-band 5G service, and then 5G plus is the millimeter wave service. And then for Verizon, it's called 5G ultra wideband. That's that's considered that the millimeter wave, so the really high network, and then nationwide 5G, which is what I often get on my phone because I have Verizon, is low band 5G, so you can get it in the middle of the grocery store. And then T-Mobile, of course, because they took over Sprint, is the only carrier with a large mid-band network. And they just called it 5G until last year when they changed the nomenclature to ultra capacity 5G, and that's for the mid-band and the millimeter wave, and then extended range 5G for low band 5G. So I know that was a lot, but I figured it would be important for people to understand a little more just as consumers, that all 5G is not necessarily the same, and that there's different coverages, but the technology itself for you as planning and zoning board members is essentially the same. So we can move on to the next slide. So in September 2018, the FCC had a declaratory ruling to remove regulatory barriers that inhibit the deployment of infrastructure necessary for 5G and other advanced wireless device services. And this was essentially kind of came from the race to 5G, which were competing with other countries around the world. And they found that there was existing laws passed in 20 states that were regulating this. So essentially this ruling preempted local authority on the matter. And remember, you're going to need, when at full build out, these are going to have to be about 300 to 500 feet across your neighborhoods and communities. So there's going to be a lot of different small cell sites, unlike existing cell towers where numerous providers can provide service on one tower. And so this order went into effect in January of 2019, which kind of got a lot of municipalities really freaked out. And we can move to the next slide. We'll talk about what that included. So the new FCC rules for 5G is, the big one is the shot clock has changed. So for co-location on pre-existing structures, it's 60 days. So pre-existing structures are things like lampposts, traffic signals, etc., things that exist along, the sidewalks and in the right of ways of your community. And then the shot clock is 90 days for new poles. And delays could be argued by providers as effective prohibition of service. So again, going back to that Telecommunications Act of 1996. The shot clocks are the same for batched applications, since you need to have more of these small cells across communities. But you can agree to different time periods by mutual agreement between the municipality and the carrier. The thing is, like, there has been talk of, these, the big providers showing up and putting an application in for 100 of these. That could be really, kind of scary and a little crazy for municipalities that don't have a ton of development happening. I don't see that happening in more rural communities. I see these happening in more developed first ring suburbs and in cities. But that's a lot for you to deal with. And the 60 days and 90 days includes all permits required for deployment, including zoning, electrical, engineering, architectural, road closure permits, anything that has to do with rolling this out. So 60 days is really not a long amount of time. And the shot clock commencement can't be delayed by a pre-application meeting. So essentially if you feel like this is happening in your community or is coming to your community, you really need to take a look at your own regulations and decide, do we have the expertise on site to be able to make the first, decision if an application is complete? Do we have enough, local expertise to review this? So we can move to the next slide. So if the application is incomplete, local governments can reset or pause the shot clock when it determines that the application is incomplete. The municipality then has 10 days to make that determination. So again, this is where you need to make sure that you have somebody on site who can really look at these applications and decide, okay, are we going to consider this complete, or are we going to need somebody to, or are we going to need them to turn it around and give us more information? So the municipality must notify the applicant of the deficiencies in writing, and the shot clock will reset when a completed application is filed. But you can't sit around on your hands. You have to make the incomplete determination by the 30th day after an application is filed. And then again, within 10 days after resubmission, if the resubmitted application is still incomplete. So again, really important to make sure that you have somebody knowledgeable on the ground at the municipal level that can handle looking at these, make sure that you're going to have a complete application before you. Then we can move on to the next slide. The FCC will also discuss fees. So in the order itself from the FCC, there are safe harbor fees, which are $500 per application for up to 5 small cells, and an additional $100 for each additional node, as well as $270 annual fee per small cell facility. It covers right-of-way access, attachments, and any other reoccurring fees, and $1,000 for non-reoccurring fees for a new pole if a new pole is required. This doesn't mean that you can't, charge more than that. The FCC just views these amounts as safe harbors because they believe that it's low enough that no carrier will challenge them if they're imposed unilaterally in a local government's regulation. So the thing is, you can charge more than that. In fact, I think in New York City, they charge more than that. They charge it based on location and a couple different things. But I think in Philadelphia, they estimate it costs $800 per small cell to review and permit. So you can go above that. The only thing is, if the carrier files a lawsuit challenging those fees, you just need to be able to demonstrate that the amounts are reasonable. And remember, this is for administrative review, not, we just want to charge more because we can charge more. So you want to make sure that it's, it's reasonable in that regard too. We can go to the next slide. And of course, with these, there are aesthetic concerns. It is permissible for location screening and color, but they should not be more restrictive than the local government requires for other infrastructure. So if you're going to take anything from this, the best thing you can do is go back and take a look at your own regulations and make sure that you have good regulations for all things in your streetscape. So we're talking about lamp posts, light posts, your traffic signals, et cetera, especially if you're a community that does have design standards. It just makes sure that they're not more restrictive. So you can't have, all wooden telephone poles throughout and then expect, 5G small cells to be like fancy, like this one in the picture, with the, cast iron with like fancy lighting. You just want to make sure that it's, similar to everything else that you would come across in the street. And the April 15, 2019 was deadline for municipalities with pending applications to adopt aesthetic criteria. That was probably the biggest thing that was upsetting to local municipalities, was the turnaround time for them to update their own codes, especially if they had somebody knocking on their door to try to, roll these out. And some good examples of prescriptive and predictable regulations are from Denver, Colorado, and Montgomery County, Maryland. So feel free to look there. And Another thing that we get a lot of questions about is, undergrounding. Like if we're a municipality that has underground utilities. And the thing is, if you do have underground utilities, it's expected that that these should also, play a role, and also um, they should also go along with that. So like you can see in this picture, it's no overled lines. Obviously, this would have been an underground mounted one. So it's important to think when you're doing streetscape improvements that, in your right of ways, you don't want to just make sure that it's utilities. You want to make sure that you're leaving room for the utilities of broadband as well, because most likely they're going to have to run fiber for this as well. So you don't want somebody coming back and forth and redigging up, your right of ways time and time again. And we can go to the next slide. Oh, and like I said, I guess I preempted myself. Some right-of-way concerns, because most likely this is where they're going to mostly be located in the future. The municipality should adopt standards for wireless installations on traffic lights, street lighting, and utility poles, and make sure you establish rules for turning off those wireless facilities when utility workers are present, because you don't want them to take the brunt of the RF emissions. Although, these 5G ones are typically lower energy than the big cell towers. But remember, you want to make sure that you're remembering to protect, your workers, as well as the primary function of your street lights and traffic lights and utility poles. So, make sure that you're setting perimeters to ensure that any new attachment is not going to limit the structure's primary function. And tips. So the big thing there is do not adopt a moratorium. It is specifically forbidden in the FCC order. So if you're worried about this, do not adopt a moratorium. I can't be more clear about that. However, review all of your codes and your standards for installation, because you can still update your local regulations. Do not deny applications based on the environmental effects of radio frequency waves. It's the same as the big towers. The idea here is there's no, this has been studied, but so far they think that there's no real environmental concerns. In fact, the 4G probably has more RF emissions overall instead of these millimeter waves. And do not impose spacing requirements. It can be construed as effective prohibition. And really, a lot of times local governments shouldn't really be involved in that anyway, because you don't really understand what service already exists, where it's going to look. So don't try to, say like, we'll allow it in this one neighborhood, so you cluster them all in one neighborhood over another, because we all know what that means. It means like, the poorer side of town is going to end up with a bunch of these, and, the wealthier side of town won't have any, but they'll be, enjoying the service. So try not to impose, don't impose spacing requirements on them at all. And then finally, be sure that your instructions and your application materials required are clear to wireless companies, as well as to yourselves. You want to make sure that whatever you're putting out there, it's an application that you understand, because you're going to have to quickly determine if the application is complete. So if you're not clear what you're asking in your application, that means you need to update it so that you understand it and the wireless companies will understand it as well. And make sure that you quickly determine if the application is complete. So do you need more staff? Do you have the staff? Do you have a game plan for when you get one of these applications? And then if the fees exceed safe levels, the local government can be challenged in court to demonstrate how higher fees are reflected in higher administrative and permitting costs by the municipality. If you have to hire somebody, which you can, like an RF, engineer or some kind of other engineer that you're going to need to do this, like you're allowed to charge more. Like you shouldn't be losing money on those. Just be sure that if you are challenged, most likely you're just going to have to prove that you're charging more based on a good idea and the fact that you need more, more review for these kinds of applications, which is, totally understandable, I think. The other thing to remember is like, most of these companies don't want to drag you to court because, again, the federal courts move pretty slowly. So, if you need extra time, most likely they're going to give you that extra time because really what they want at the end of the day is to put their little small note in your community. So, leverage that, like leverage the fact that they want something, you want something in return as well. If you need extra time to do it, like you can do that. And the next slide is just our final slide, which is how to get in touch with us when you have questions. I don't see any questions at the moment. Feel free to use either the chat feature or the Q&A if this inspired anything. If not, you can always send your thoughts or comments as well. Chris, is there anything you want to add?
Yeah, I have a few things. I just want to say at the end here that since we've been out of the office, since the coronavirus emergency, I don't think I've had a single question about 5G or telecommunications facilities. There were lots of them before when this was really the big news, but I don't think I've personally responded to any questions on 5G. So I'm wondering, my questions for you, Paula, are one, have you had any? And two, do you think that the initial rollout was
probably a little slower now?
It's slowed down.
Due to the fact that one, we went into a pandemic, and if you sign up for one of these, usually the service is an additional fee on top of usually what I would say ridiculous cellular fees as it is. So there's probably maybe not as many people trying to get in on the ground floor of this, though the iPhone 12 is selling pretty seriously across the board. So, I think if you're in a pretty dense, community, you're going to see more of this than you are in a rural community. I think it still has time to build out to that extent. I'd be curious if anybody on here, if you want to use the chat box, do you have a 5G enabled device? Do you have 5G service in your community? Is it something that you're wanting in the future?
I'm curious too, because
so if you do, feel free to
just write it in the chat.
Good to know. I think a lot of it was probably slowed down to an extent because of the fact that it's difficult to get into municipalities because of the fact that a lot of people went, closed their town halls and city halls and whatnot. So there might have been that, plus the fact that the economy really took a hit probably also slowed down maybe some of this.
Yeah, and I was really surprised at when we learned a lot of this stuff, when there was a lot of the initial passage of the declaratory action and the deadline for local governments submitting their aesthetic criteria. I think there was a rush in major metro areas of a 5G network deployment. And then I think time will tell where it ends up eventually, because one of our themes in our division is talking about the vast stretches of upstate New York that have a real broadband deficiency. And I think that the places, and you've discovered yourself, Paula, those places where you have real 5G access are pretty limited at this point. And I think this is one of the things that happens when the private market is charged with deploying a utility. And some have argued that market demand, not the preempting of review criteria, will drive the deployment of a 5G network. So if you said local governments can't restrict these at all, like it wouldn't speed up the deployment of the network. Like if local governments were just totally rolled over, and in fact, and I hope this has helped some. I know that in New York City, some of the application fees have been adjusted to, there's some higher costs in those places where there's a lot of incentive for the deployment of a 5G network because they're higher income neighborhoods, and the application fees have been lowered for those in neighborhoods that really need the infrastructure more, where the market wouldn't drive the deployment to quite the same degree. So I hope that works to some extent. I'm also curious, maybe you can summarize, Paula, the difference between the low, middle, and high frequency 5G variations that you described on that first slide when you define 5G. It's the highest frequency that is the most distinctive and probably the hardest to come by at this point. Yeah. And that's the kind of frequency that is going to have to be available for self-driving cars and a lot of the Internet of Things, is it not?
Yeah. So we did have a question that came in about like my Spectrum claims that is providing 5G according to my modem, and my cell phone says it's receiving 5G as well. So yeah, that is true. And this also gets confused with people with their modems, because you'll have a modem and it'll say 5G as well. If that's not technically the same thing. So again, there's confusion in the nomenclature, and they don't make it very clear for people to understand. So the three flavors again of 5G is the millimeter waves. So those are the tiniest frequency, tiniest wavelengths that are at higher frequencies. And those are the ones that will give you like the capacity to download like a movie in a couple seconds. There's not a ton of places that have that. The most is really you see is more the low band 5G, which is like just a lower band, like it's a bigger band or it's a bigger wavelength, but it's less powered. And there was openings in that, being able to provide that service across those airwaves, because all the airwaves are owned by different characters. So the mid bands, which is even faster, mostly was owned by the military. So you can't use bands that don't belong to you. But now that they're mostly weren't using them, they've auctioned them off. So now you can provide service through those bands. So it's different frequencies than 4G. 4G is, I think, lower. And then these ones are all above it. It's higher powered. So it opened up the area. Plus, the reason why we really needed 5G is because all of the radio frequency waves that are in 5G itself, unfortunately, are mostly crowded because we have so many devices. So essentially, we had to come up with a new frequency to broadcast these waves, because all of the other radio frequency waves that we already use have already been tapped out almost to its maximum use. So we had to find a new place. So we essentially just changed the frequencies, and essentially that's what that fifth generation is. I'm not sure if that's clear or not.
It's pretty clear to me, thanks. Paula, have you heard, there was another question about fires, fires on small cell. I haven't heard anything about fire hazards being,
not particularly,
a problem
probably
on
because
small cell.
They are lower energy than the big macro cells. They use less energy. So I'm gonna assume that there's probably not as many
Less
fire
risk, yeah.
hazards, but
Yeah, that
the
was
funny
mine
thing
too.
is, since the beginning of the pandemic, we've actually seen people, there's a lot of conspiracy theories around 5G. So we've seen um, people actually disassemble them from their communities because, you know, they think that it has something to do with the pandemic. So um, so we've seen a lot of you know, issues there too.
There were a couple questions
Oh,
having to
there's the thing
do.
about wired connections. Do you agree that wired connections like fiber and cable are faster, healthier, more secure, more energy efficient, and environmentally sound? So the thing here is you have to have fiber to offer 5G. They piggyback off each other. So you need to have some kind of fiber. So it's better, I think, personally, if we all had a fiber connection going into every house in America. Personally, I would think that would make a lot more sense. But unfortunately, we haven't seen that really get, that hasn't been a huge interest, I think, of the big providers to roll it out to that extent. I think it would be better for that, which I think is also why fiber and 5G isn't going to get to our most rural communities, mostly because of the fact that there's not a huge amount of demand there, and to lay that kind of fiber out to those places is still really expensive. We still need to figure out a way to do, whoever comes up with the next best thing to lay fiber in a place where you don't have to totally bury it, or you can somehow figure out how to, you know, instill it in the road and it's not going to get damaged over time. Like, they're probably the next billionaire.
Yeah, yeah. The same questioner asked about whether, about seeker and its place in reviewing of permits for telecommunications facilities. And I would just say seeker is part of the process of seeker has to be considered when granting when conducting site plan review, granting special use permits. And I do want to emphasize one of the points that I didn't make earlier for those gaps in service. If there is a gap in service and there's no question about that gap in service, the permit has to be granted, or the zoning has to be changed, or a variance has to be granted. Whatever you do, you have to, there use variances for telecommunications facilities don't go by the 4-factor test that we drill in when we talk about use variances in Zoning Board of Appeals overview. The tower, local governments can't stand in the way of telecommunications infrastructure. So seeker would be done in the same way that it's done for any application. It mitigates the environmental effects. And the point about the same questioner asked about why NEPA is being ignored by the FCC when Supreme Court decisions say they must perform NEPA. I'm not sure what this question really gets to, because I know that the National Environmental Protection Policy Act was a factor, had to be considered in the passing of these new regulations. So I'm going to have to do a little research into this question because there was a follow-up here about whether we're aware of current challenges to FCC regulations regarding their failure to update. Do you know about that?
Well, the FCC regulations about 5G are always, there was a bunch of states that came together to challenge them. I think it's still tied up in the federal court system. I mean, the thing here is we have to remember, with a new administration, we have a new FCC chair. So in that regard, like, every administration is going to bring in a different perspective to this arena. So There was a lot of municipalities that were really upset about the 5G regulation. So we'll see if that moves anywhere soon.
I haven't
So
heard
keep
about
kind
any
of an idea.
decisions though. Like, I don't
No,
think
like I
there's
said,
been
I think
any
it's probably
resolution.
getting dragged out
Mhm.
just because, I don't even remember what circuit they were trying to do it in anyway. So, but as soon as some kind of big decisions made on that like you'll see tech articles.
Yeah, we'll hear about it.
Yeah.
You'll probably hear about it before you even see this course again. But in a Southern Tier West webinar or on-site workshop or conference, I think we've given this is at least the third time we've done it. And I'm surprised that we don't get this course requested more frequently around the state. We've given it a handful of times in the last 2 or 3 years since we've done our substantial updates. And it's been requested more than once or twice, more than twice, I think, for Southern Tier West. So stay tuned on that. And I think with that, it's about 3:30, and take note of the telephone number and the email address on this last slide. Whoops, I think I just moved beyond it. And send your emails to that general email address. They'll get forwarded to one of us. We're still working outside the office remotely. And if you call our office, leave a message and your call will be forwarded to one of us and we can talk one-on-one about your questions. Thank you and good luck to you in your reviews of this and other applications, and stay well. Thank you, Paula.
Chris and Paula.
No problem.
Thanks for
Time with
having
us
us.
this afternoon.
Our pleasure.
You're welcome, Sarah. Thanks for having us. Talk to you soon.
Anything else before I end the webinar?
Nothing from me.
I think I'm good, except I have to figure out the next time I do a presentation how not to mess myself up with my screens. So we'll look forward to doing this again with you soon, Sarah.
Sounds good. I think you did well, Chris.
Thank you. I think Paula did especially well. Thanks,
Yeah,
Paula.
she's really good at it.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
thanks, guys.
Well, you guys take care.
Yeah,
You too,
we'll see you
Sarah.
soon.
Stay well.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.